Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Kaylan Purisima, and my project is called Examining Violence Against Indigenous Women in the United States Through a Settler Colonialist Framework. Just a little bit more about me. I'm a Peace and Justice and French and Francophone Studies double major on the honors major track. My advisors are Dr. Geddick and Dr. Remster, and for my topic, I'm exploring the question of how does the United States contribute to violence against Indigenous women? Now, there's a lot of background information that has to be understood about this topic in order to fully understand my analysis later. I'm just going to start out by reading some statistics so you can all grasp the deep severity of this problem. Native women experience the highest per capita rate of rape in the nation. 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. On reservations, they experience murder rates 10 times the national average. 4 to 5 Native women are affected by violence, and 88% of violent crimes committed against Indigenous women are perpetrated by non-Native people. It's important to note that this last one is an abnormality in US criminology because violent crime in the US is almost always intraracial. I just want you to keep this specific figure in mind for later because it's going to come back into play. Now, it's really important for me to talk about settler colonialism because this and its effects were the backbone of my entire project. The scholar Cox defines it as an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of Indigenous peoples and cultures. It includes interlocking forms of oppression, including racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. It has worked over the centuries to embed racist and sexist ideologies that dehumanize Native peoples to the point where violence against Native women is excused or even encouraged. Over the years, settler colonialism has just created the framework to introduce the factors and conditions that are conducive to violence today. So it's necessary to look back and see when settlers arrived in 1492, because they completely changed gender roles and introduced the patriarchy and domestic violence to Native tribes. So historically, Native women had economic, spiritual, and political power that European women did not have. Gender was presented with a division of duties and with an emphasis on balance. Not all roles in tribal nations were extremely strict, and not even every tribe was on the gender binary. Some tribes are even matriarchies. So when settlers came, they imposed this patriarchy as well as introduced domestic violence, and these all helped to start the cycles of violence. Now, understanding a little bit more background information, I can explain about how the literature reviews the problem of violence against Indigenous women. It generally points to settler colonialism and its effects as the main reason for why the violence is so prevalent, such as the patriarchy and the changing gender rules, like I just mentioned before. However, many scholars study more in depth one specific outgrowth of settler colonialism, which is that of jurisdictional issues and their consequences. Jurisdiction in law refers to government power, often focusing on the power of the courts. And the US has spent the last several centuries trying to take away as much jurisdictional power from tribes as possible. But tribal jurisdiction is so important because the erosion of it prevents women from getting justice. So one clear example of jurisdictional erosion, how devastating it is for women, is the Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe Supreme Court case of 1978. This case held that tribal governments can no longer exercise its jurisdiction over non-Native perpetrators. In other words, if a person who was not Native committed a crime against a Native person, the tribal government did not have jurisdiction over this crime anymore. And this decision just completely eradicated tribal ability to maintain law and order on their lands and among their people. The US government divested them of their ability to serve justice with this ruling. Now, remember back to when I said that 88% of crimes against Native women are perpetrated by non-Native people. And just think about how devastating this decision was, because now so many of these women lack justice. Now, going to my research, I looked at both scholarly and non-scholarly sources, which were a mix of primary and secondary. One source I consulted especially a lot was the book pictured on the left, Beginning and End of Rape by Sarah Deer, who was just considered to be an expert in this subject and hugely influential, so I'd be remiss if I didn't study her. I did a textual analysis of 2 different texts, the 1823 Supreme Court case, Johnson and Graham's Leslie versus McIntosh, and the 2013 Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. I chose the first text because it's lesser known policy, but it's still so important. So I want to show how even smaller policies still have such a huge impact on Indigenous women. And VAWA is one of the most recent, very influential policies on Native women. So I needed to study it. And then choosing 2 from very distinct time periods, I could study kind of what progress, if any, has been made in the last 190 years in between them. And 2 theories I used as frameworks were Western feminist theory and Indigenous feminist theory. I kept in mind Indigenous feminist theory over and instead of Western feminist theory, because Indigenous feminist theory prioritizes intersectional feminism as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and just looks at how oppression against women interlocks with colonization instead of how Western feminism ignores this really important aspect. So first, I looked at the 1823 Supreme Court case. At that time, the Supreme Court was headed by Chief Justice John Marshall, and he speaks for the whole US government here. The question of the case was, can an Indigenous tribe convey land to individuals in the United States? Some more context is that in 1775, Thomas Johnson and some other British citizens bought land in Virginia from the Piankashaw tribe. When Johnson died, his heirs inherited the land. Then in 1818, William McIntosh bought from Congress 11,000 acres of this land that Johnson originally bought in 1775. But Johnson's heirs sued McIntosh in the U.S. District Court to try to get their land back. But the federal district court ruled that the Piankashaw tribe never had the right to convey the land in the first place and maintained that Johnson's initial purchase and the chain of title that came from that were all invalid. The Supreme Court unanimously maintained that Johnson's initial purchase was invalid and that McIntosh's claim was now superior. So what Chief Justice Marshall established in this ruling is that the federal government is the sole party who has the right to negotiation with Native tribes. The natives themselves do not even have the right to sell property to individuals, which is why Johnson's purchase was ruled invalid, since he bought property from a tribe while McIntosh bought it from Congress. I found this document to be an 1823 version of land dispossession. While settlers are not outwardly taking away Indigenous land, there's still a government of settlers preventing natives from full autonomy over their land. And separation from one's own lands creates a foundation for violence against Native women because of the similarity in this mindset of violence against land and violence against women. I also found this document to be a metaphor for how the US sees Native women as property, because at this time, Western law recognized all women as property of their fathers and husbands. So while this case isn't blatantly about women's autonomy, the decision about Native property dealings just represents how the US sees Native women simply as property still and wishes to take away their autonomy. There's also such a strong settler colonialist framework in this document that I found, especially evidenced by the language. The language is very passive and neutral. It shows how Marshall is trying to avoid responsibility for US actions. He also calls natives as savages repeatedly, in comparison to the great, perfect, and civilized European nations. The word Indian arises 100 times in this document, and this term is actually still the official legal term for natives today, American Indian. But this is dangerous because this is a colonizer given name that reminds natives of their traumas every day. One study found that 96% of natives would choose to identify by their tribal nation. So finally, this document's important because Marshall uses this doctrine of discovery to falsely justify settler taking of land and Native women. The doctrine of discovery, he says, is the foundation of title in European nations, and this overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives. So what it is the legal justification for US actions against Indigenous peoples. He even states that the Americas were authorized to discover and take possession of such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands. In this, he includes their taking of Native women too. Overall, I just found this document to be incredibly damaging to Native tribes and Native women. My second text that I studied was the 2013 Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which is considered a huge victory for Native women because it reverses the decision in the Oliphant versus Suquamish Supreme Court case that disallowed tribal governments from prosecuting non-Native perpetrators, as I mentioned earlier. So while this horrible jurisdictional decision is now reversed, it comes with a big asterisk at the end. There's still just such a strong settler colonialist framework that I found in this writing, because throughout the whole document, the language displayed this continued supremacy of the US government with the simultaneous subjugation of the natives. And like I said, there's a huge asterisk at the end of this jurisdictional ability. So now the tribal governments have jurisdiction, but only in cases of domestic violence. So only in the cases where someone committed violence and where the spouses, former spouses, parent of a child in common, or dating partners of the Native women. So if it was a stranger, if it was an acquaintance, it was relative, if it was a child rape, the tribal governments still don't have jurisdiction. So this is, for me, the greatest feeling of this act, and just very blatantly shows that it still carries this colonial framework that oppresses Native women. Another important aspect to know is that it actually expired in 2018 and it has still failed to renew today. So even if it gets renewed in 2021, it will still have this colonial connotation because how long it's taking to give back these basic protections for Native women, especially when it was the US government who took them away in the first place. In terms of evolution, it's still clear that some progress has been made from the first Supreme Court case to the 2013 reauthorization of VAWA. So on the right, I showed Deb Haaland, who's the current Secretary of the Interior. I just included an image of her to represent some of the progress that's been made, since she's the first Native serving as a cabinet secretary. In general, more Native women have been protected, and less derogatory language is being used to describe them. But there's still so much more progress to be made. Like I said, the word Indian, American Indian, is still the official legal term. They might not be using savage anymore, but there's still so much demeaning language and subtleties that I found in VAWA that just overall imply the superiority of the US government in all affairs over natives. This settler colonialist framework so is still very much still there, especially by evidenced by the giant loophole in VAWA and the fact that it expired years ago and still hasn't been reauthorized. But probably the biggest difference I see from 1823 to 2013 is that in 1823, the US government was very evident about their harm against Native women. And more recently, the government is still creating this harm, but they're just hiding it better. Because of all the media attention, it's very hard to escape criticism. So they have resorted to scooping their actions more under the table, but they're still there. Well, now, even though this crisis is extremely dire, moving forward, there's still a lot of possible solutions to try to stop this epidemic. So in order to really try to emerge from this pattern of violence and dismantle the settler colonialist framework, we need to start by acknowledging our history, educating ourselves, and taking action. We must close this VAWA loophole by giving Native governments full jurisdictional control over crimes related to Native persons on Native land. Reports show that when tribes are given more local control, they're successful in arresting and convicting perpetrators. Providing much more extensive and funded healthcare is an absolute must, especially reproductive healthcare, such as rape kits that must be more readily available to survivors. Healthcare in general is just so important for Native women because chronic health conditions like diabetes or obesity can be triggered or aggravated by unresolved psychological trauma like sexual assault. Finally, the scholar Sarah Deer calls for reshaping and reclaiming tribal responses to rape. So in terms of decolonizing it and redefining it, with each tribe having their own personalized systems and definitions for dealing with it. She proposes creating rape reform for Native women using stories of survivors, historical anti-rape activism, and starting respectful conversations. And I support all these proposals. Now, I want to conclude this presentation by just emphasizing why we should all care about this topic. There's just a general huge lack of attention to this topic, to Native peoples and histories, both academically, in mass media, and personal circles. And this is just a huge problem I find because as non-natives, I believe that we have a moral obligation to, at the very least, acknowledge and understand our own privilege that comes from benefiting from the historical and current oppressions of Native peoples every day. And unfortunately, it's not just the US problem. Indigenous peoples all over the world are suffering very similar problems. And that's what makes it even more important that we understand what's happening around us. In conclusion, this has been a very long process. There's been a lot of changes in topics. It was very challenging to navigate my complete and utter lack of understanding or knowledge on this topic in the beginning. But I always had to keep in mind that I had the privilege of deciding to learn about this topic because it was not my everyday reality. So my initial goal was to become an expert as much as possible on this subject. And while I would still say that I have tons more to learn, I'm so excited that I've learned as much as I have so far. And I look forward to centering Native activism and stories in my life as I move forward. So what started out as me reading this simple book on the right that features a few Alaskan Native characters has turned into this whole path for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for your really interesting presentation. So as we wait for another question to roll in, I wanted to ask, what are your, you've talked about moving forward with your interest and pursuing this. So what are your plans for the future for your research and your involvement in this important topic?
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I don't necessarily have plans to progress with this specific research project. I just kind of meant it in a more general way. So I realized something I alluded to is that I really knew nothing about anything related to this before I embarked on this project, which I find to be a personal failing. So I just have started integrating more Native stories and peoples in my life in general as much as I could. So I just kind of look forward to staying educated, instead of just doing one big project, just doing little things every day to keep myself aware.
Okay, we have a question about Canada appears to be more progressive in its use of language. Instead of American Indian, they use terms Aboriginal, First Nations, and Natives as preferred. So is that something, did you encounter any of that in your research?
Yeah, I definitely know Canada is slightly more advanced than the United States on this topic. Unfortunately, there is a lot of similar threads in the treatment of Native peoples, but they seem to be slightly more advanced in terms of land acknowledgements. Some, I don't know much, so I can't speak, but generally that is the common thread that I hear, although I'm sure there's still a lot more progress to be made there. But I feel like in terms of the United States, we're just starting to think about these topics. So I really look forward to seeing, when universities such as Villanova can more readily acknowledge the land that they're on. So when we can change the legal nomenclature to change from being American Indian, which is very problematic. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing that hopefully soon.
And then any suggestions for the audience on how we can become more conscious on privileging Native voices in our daily lives? And what recommendations do you have on media we can consume more regularly to educate ourselves?
Something that I've done, and it's very unfortunate because Native peoples are among, I think they're the most underrepresented group in the media out of all underprivileged groups. But something I've done, which might not apply to everyone in the room, but honestly, just following more Native influencers, especially on TikTok, which I'm sure not everyone has. But I've learned so much just talking about the food they eat or the different cultures that they're in, their language. Or on Instagram, they have a lot of question and answer sessions where you can just go and listen to everything they have to say because there's a lot of amazing people who are willing to share with you and kind of do the work for you. They're willing to tell you everything if you're just there to listen. So I found it to be really, really informative. And Chloe, if you want later, I can send you some more specific names.
And then there's lots of questions coming in, but one of the questions was about what can interested, how can we contribute to the change?
I would say it definitely takes a lot of small steps. Unfortunately, I don't know if any of us here are going to be the ones closing the loophole in VAWA, but it takes all of us to collectively make small steps. And the first step really is education, just because this is a topic and just groups of people that a lot of people just don't know about, and we don't really know the history about that. And I found that even to be, like I said, a personal failing that I found in my own life. So just starting to read more about Native people's stories, learning more, trying to read more books by them. So I see a lot of really great recommendations in the chat. So thank you. I also have some books too that I've read I could recommend. But yeah, I mean, Watershed Pictures at Villanova is doing a film too on kind of like Native women this year. So that should be really exciting. So just in small ways, trying to stay educated, reading the media, trying to read more Native journals and not necessarily, CNN articles about Native peoples, but trying to privilege the Native voices. And it's very hard too, because the hardest thing is even just talking about Native peoples generally. I mean, there's so many hundreds and hundreds of different groups and nations I'm talking about here. So even just that is difficult in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Kaylan. It was a really interesting presentation, and look forward to doing some of the reading suggested in the chat.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.